The telegram was still clutched in Edwin Prescott's hand when she stepped off the stage, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something was wrong. Not wrong the way a man knows when a horse throws a shoe or a storm is rolling in from the northwest. Wrong the way a man knows when the ground beneath his feet is not the solid earth he believed it to be, but something hollow, something that could cave without a single moment's warning. The woman descending from the overland stage in Redemption Creek, Texas, on that blazing afternoon in September of 1878 was not the woman he had been expecting. She was not, he was suddenly and terribly certain, the woman named on this telegram. The telegram read, "Clara Whitmore, arriving September 14th, Redemption Creek. She has agreed to the arrangement." The woman before him was perhaps 24, 25 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned beneath a traveling hat that had seen better days, eyes the color of deep river water in the late afternoon, and a chin that carried in it a stubborn kind of courage that Edwin recognized instinctively, because he had seen that same stubbornness in his own mirror every morning for the last 31 years. She was not unattractive. She was, in fact, entirely the opposite. But she was not Clara Whitmore. He knew what Clara Whitmore looked like. He had a daguerreotype, sent with the first letter, tucked in the breast pocket of his good coat. Clara Whitmore had pale blonde hair and round, soft features, and she had been 32 years old when the photograph was taken, the widow of a Philadelphia dry goods merchant who had died of consumption the previous winter. This woman had none of those features, not a single one. She descended the last step of the stage and stood on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek with a single leather traveling bag in her hand and a look on her face that Edwin could only describe as terrified resolve, the expression of someone who has committed to a dangerous course of action and refuses to turn back even as every reasonable instinct screams at them to run. Their eyes met. He watched something flash across her face in that instant. Recognition. Fear. And then something desperate, a choice being made behind those dark eyes in less than a heartbeat. She smiled at him, a smile that was too bright, too practiced, and heartbreakingly fragile at its edges. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and her voice was steady as iron even as her knuckles whitened around the handle of her bag. "I am so very glad to have arrived safely." He should have said it right then. He should have unfolded the telegram, pointed to the name, and asked her plainly who she was and what she was doing wearing another woman's identity like a borrowed coat. He should have sent her back on the next stage and washed his hands of the entire arrangement. He did not do any of those things. What Edwin Prescott did was fold the telegram slowly, tuck it into the inside pocket of his coat, alongside the daguerreotype of a woman this stranger would never resemble, remove his hat and say, "Miss Whitmore, welcome to Redemption Creek." The lie settled between them like a third person, and neither of them acknowledged it, and the whole town of Redemption Creek went on about its business in the September heat, entirely unaware that something had just begun that would shake both of their lives down to the very foundation. It had been 3 months earlier, in June of 1878, that Edwin Prescott had sat across from his ranch foreman, a weathered man named Gus Calloway, and admitted that the Prescott Ranch was in trouble. Not financial trouble, though the last 2 years had been lean enough. The trouble was of a different kind, the slow, grinding kind that comes from running 4,000 acres of Texas cattle country with a skeleton crew and no one to manage the house, keep the accounts straight, maintain the relationships with the merchants in town, or provide the sort of steady domestic anchor that turned a working property into a livable life. Edwin had been running the ranch alone since his father, Thomas Prescott, died of a heart seizure in the spring of 1876. He was 29 at the time. He was now 31, and the loneliness had become something he could almost touch, a physical weight that settled across his shoulders in the evenings and refused to lift. Gus had suggested the arrangement with a casualness that Edwin suspected was carefully calculated. The Harrington outfit up in Colorado, They used a matrimonial correspondent agency out of Kansas City, Gus said, poking at the fire in the ranch house hearth. Man writes a letter, woman writes back. You exchange some photographs, conduct a proper correspondence, and if both parties agree, she comes out on the stage. Legal and respectable. Edwin had resisted the idea for approximately 3 weeks before writing the letter. The agency, a firm called Westward Hearths with offices on Delaware Street in Kansas City, had been the one to match him with Clara Whitmore. They had sent him her letter and the daguerreotype, and Clara's letter had been sensible and direct. She was a widow, she was accustomed to hard work. She understood that frontier life was demanding, and she had no romantic illusions about it. She wanted security, a home, a new beginning. He had written back with equal plainness. He offered security and honest partnership. He was not promising poetry. The correspondence had continued through July and August. Clara's letters were pleasant, measured, sometimes even warm. They were the letters of a woman making a practical decision and making her peace with it. Edwin had begun, cautiously, to feel a kind of tentative hope about the whole business. And then Clara had not come. The woman who stepped off the stage in her place was Sadie Dawson, though Edwin would not know that name for another 2 days. Sadie Dawson had been Clara Whitmore's traveling companion, neighbor, and closest friend in Philadelphia. They had lived in adjacent boarding house rooms for the 2 years following Clara's widowhood, and in those 2 years they had become the kind of friends who share meals, secrets, and the particular bond that forms between women who are both navigating the world without a man's protection in an era that makes such navigation brutally difficult. When Clara had received Edwin Prescott's second letter, the one that confirmed the arrangement and provided stage passage from Kansas City to Redemption Creek via the Overland Stage Company, she had shared every detail with Sadie over supper in their shared parlor. And then, on the 3rd of September, 11 days before she was supposed to depart, Clara Whitmore had contracted typhoid fever from a contaminated water pumped 2 blocks from their boarding house. She had been dead within 6 days. Sadie had sat beside her through all of it. She had held her hand through the delirium. She had smoothed her hair. She had been with her at the end, and she had wept until she had nothing left to weep. And then she had sat in the terrible silence of Clara's empty room and looked at the stage ticket on the dresser. The stage ticket. The letter from a ranch owner in Texas she had read so many times that she could have recited it from memory. A man who sounded steady and decent, and who was offering something that Sadie Dawson had never had, a place that was hers, safety. A future that did not involve the threat that had been gathering around her own life for the past year like a storm that refused to break. Because Sadie Dawson had a dark past of her own and a hidden motive for wanting to disappear, and the telegram to Edwin Prescott had already been sent in Clara's name confirming her arrival date, and the boarding house proprietor had given her 2 weeks before the room needed to be vacated, and Philadelphia held nothing for Sadie anymore except danger. The danger had a name: Victor Crane. Victor Crane was a man Sadie had worked for 18 months earlier, when she had first arrived in Philadelphia from her hometown of Harrisburg with $40, a sewing case, and desperate optimism. Crane ran an establishment on Vine Street that presented itself publicly as a photography studio and print shop, but was in fact a clearinghouse for forged land documents, a trade that in the post-war years had made certain men in eastern cities extraordinarily wealthy at the expense of settlers and freed families trying to establish legal claims to property across the expanding territories. Sadie had not known what Crane was doing when she took the job as his bookkeeper. She had been hired to maintain accounts and ledgers, and she had been good at it, exceptionally good, the product of a father who had been a rural school teacher and who had taught his only daughter arithmetic and letters with equal rigor before dying of a farm accident when she was 16. By the time Sadie understood the true nature of the business she was recording so neatly in her ledgers, she had been working for Victor Crane for 4 months, and she knew too much. She had tried to leave quietly. She had given her notice on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1877, citing health reasons, and had returned to her room to find it turned over. Crane had sent men with a very clear message. The ledgers she had been keeping were detailed enough to convict him and several associates. He could not allow her to simply walk out of his orbit. She had fled to a different boarding house, made herself invisible, and spent the next year in a state of quiet, constant terror. Clara had been her anchor in that time, the one person who knew her real situation and helped her maintain the careful invisibility that kept her safe. And now Clara was gone. Sadie had not planned it as a deception, not exactly. She had planned it as survival. She had told herself on the night she made the decision that she would write to Edwin Prescott from the road, somewhere between Kansas City and Texas, and explain everything. She would give him the choice. She would not force herself on a man who had made an arrangement with a different woman. She had written the letter twice on the stage between Kansas City and San Antonio. She had torn it up twice. By the time she reached Redemption Creek, she had not sent the letter. She had not been able to make herself send it, because what the letter said, stripped of all its careful apologies, was this: "I am a fraud, I am being hunted by a criminal, I am bringing my dark past to your door, and I would like to stay anyway." She could not write that. So she had stepped off the stage wearing Clara Whitmore's name on the telegram and looked into the steady gray eyes of Edwin Prescott, and she had let the lie stand. The first evening at the Prescott Ranch was an exercise in sustained terror for Sadie, though she was determined that none of it would show on her face. The ranch was larger than she had imagined from Edwin's letters. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from limestone that had been quarried from the hills to the west of the property, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a kitchen addition built off the back. It was not elegant, but it was built to last, and there was something in its solid, unornamented permanence that struck Sadie as deeply, almost painfully beautiful after years of rented rooms and borrowed spaces. Edwin had driven her out from town in his wagon with a hired hand named Pedro riding behind on horseback, maintaining a respectful distance that Sadie suspected was less about propriety and more about giving his employer room to assess this new arrival without an audience. Edwin himself had said very little on the 20-minute ride. He had asked about her journey, whether she required any particular accommodation for her health, and whether she had eaten. He was polite. He was contained. And he watched her out of the corner of his eye, with a steadiness that she found both reassuring and alarming. The housekeeper, a stout Mexican woman named Dolores who had worked the property since before Thomas Prescott's death, had prepared a cold supper of roasted chicken, corn bread, and dried fruit preserves, and had set it out in the dining room with the kind of careful, evaluative hospitality that made clear she was reserving all final judgments. "Dolores has been keeping this house running since before I was taking it seriously," Edwin told Sadie at supper, in what she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic style, plain and honest and without flattery, directed at Dolores rather than at Sadie. "I expect you will find her opinion on most domestic matters to be the correct one." Dolores had looked at Sadie then with dark, measuring eyes and said, "You look like you have not slept in some days." "I have not," Sadie admitted, and it was the first entirely truthful thing she had said since stepping off the stage, and she felt the strange relief of it. That night, alone in the guest room that was clearly not yet the room she would occupy permanently, since the arrangement required a proper ceremony before any change in domestic status, Sadie lay on the narrow iron bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to calculate her position clearly. She had presented herself as Clara Whitmore. Edwin had accepted that identity without challenge, though she was increasingly certain from the quality of his silence that he was not entirely without suspicion. She did not know how long she could sustain the identity before something cracked it open. She did not know whether she could confess before that happened, or whether the confession would simply be the end of everything. What she did know, lying in the darkness with the September wind moving through the cottonwood outside her window, was that this ranch, this plain limestone house, this contained and watchful man, represented something she had not felt since her father was alive. She felt for the first time in more than a year something approaching safety. She could not afford to lose it. She was still awake when the clock in the hall below struck 2, and she made her decision then in the deep quiet of the Texas night. She would not confess the identity. Not yet. She would earn her place here first. She would show Edwin Prescott by her actions and her character and her labor that whoever she was worth keeping. And when the truth came out, as she knew with dark certainty that it eventually would, she would face it from a position of something rather than nothing. It was not the most honest plan she had ever made, but it was the most human. The first week at the Prescott Ranch established a pattern that was both domestic and quietly electric with unspoken tension. Sadie threw herself into the work of the house with a ferocity that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. She had competent hands, a good memory for organization, and the particular combination of practicality and thoroughness that her father's early education had given her. Within 2 days she had gone through the ranch's account books, which Edwin maintained in a loose and functional but imprecise manner, and had found 3 places where the figures didn't reconcile, not through dishonesty, but through simple arithmetic errors. She showed him on the 3rd morning, spreading the ledger across the kitchen table while Dolores made coffee at the stove, and Edwin leaned over her shoulder to look at the numbers. He was close enough that she could smell the morning sun on his shirt and the faint, clean scent of the soap he used, and she kept her attention rigorously on the columns of figures because the alternative was too complicated to consider. "You are right," he said after a moment. "How did you catch that?" "My father taught me bookkeeping," she said. "He was a teacher. He believed arithmetic was the most honest discipline because numbers do not lie." There was a pause, small but weighted, and she felt it on the back of her neck. "Numbers do not lie," Edwin repeated carefully. "What about the people who write them down?" She met his eyes then. He was looking at her with that gray, steady gaze that she was beginning to find both infuriating and disarming in equal measure. "The people who write them down sometimes make mistakes," she said. "Not always from dishonesty." "No," he agreed. "Not always." They looked at each other for a moment that went on several beats longer than was strictly comfortable. And then Dolores set 2 cups of coffee on the table with a decisive clink, and the moment dissolved. She began to ride out with him on the 4th day. This surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He had mentioned over supper that he needed to check the fence line along the northern boundary before the fall cattle drive, and she had heard herself say, without quite planning to, that she could ride and would like to come along if it was not an inconvenience. He had looked at her for a moment with that measuring quality she was beginning to associate specifically with him, as if he was weighing things, and then he had said, 6 in the morning. She had been in the yard at 5:45. The Texas range in the early morning light of September was a revelation. Sadie had grown up in Pennsylvania Hill country, where autumn meant color and enclosure, and the particular intimate beauty of forested landscape. This was different in every conceivable way, vast and open and almost aggressively lit, the sky enormous, and the light so clean and hard that it made everything look like it had been cut from metal. The grass was going dry and gold at the tips, and there were cedar and mesquite along the creek bottoms. And in the early coolness before the heat built, the whole country smelled of dust and dried grass, and something sweet she couldn't identify that she would later learn was a wild sage species particular to that part of Texas. Edwin rode beside her without the stiff self-consciousness that men sometimes displayed toward women in public spaces, without the slightly performative consideration that Sadie had always found condescending. He simply rode beside her as he would have ridden beside another competent adult, pointing out the landmarks of his property with a quiet pride that she found more moving than any boasting would have been. My father ran 300 head on this land when he first broke it in 1859, Edwin said as they rode the northern fence line, the morning warming rapidly around them. When he died in 76, we were running close to 2,000. The Comanche raids of the 60s had pushed us back, and then the market collapsed in 73, and then the drought in 75. He spent the last 2 years of his life rebuilding. He built well, Sadie said. She meant the observation as simple acknowledgement, but something in her tone must have struck him as genuine rather than polite, because he glanced at her with something less guarded than his usual expression. He did, Edwin said, better than he knew. She learned over the course of that morning that Edwin had been the only child of Thomas and Margaret Prescott, that his mother had died when he was 8 from a fever that swept through the county, that he had been educated by a circuit schoolmaster until the age of 14, and then self-educated thereafter through a combination of his father's modest library and a determined and ongoing effort that he described without particular pride as necessary. He was, she understood, a man who had made himself rather than having been made by institutions or circumstances, which was perhaps why he carried that quality of self-containment so naturally. She also learned obliquely why he had arranged for a wife through the agency, not because he required domestic management, though he did, but because the loneliness had become, in his own careful and not quite direct admission, a weight that does not shift on its own. She wanted to tell him that she understood that weight entirely. She wanted to tell him a great many things, but the name on the telegram was still standing between them, and she had not yet found the courage to step through it. The crisis came, as she had known in some cold and honest part of herself that it would, from a direction she had not expected. On the 9th day, a rider came to the ranch house with a letter. It was a man Sadie did not recognize, wearing the dusty clothes of a long-distance traveler and carrying a leather dispatch bag with a Kansas City postal mark. The letter was addressed to Edwin Prescott and had been sent by the Westward Hearths Agency. Sadie was standing on the porch when the rider came in, and she watched Edwin take the letter and open it with the focused patience he brought to everything. She watched his face as he read it. She saw the stillness that came over him, different from his usual containment. This was a stillness that had stone in it. He looked up from the letter. He looked at her. "Come inside," he said. He said it quietly, without heat, without any of the cold fury she had half expected, and somehow the quietness of it was worse. She followed him into the front room of the house, the room with the good chairs and the photographs on the mantelpiece, and a window that looked out over the front yard toward the distant line of hills to the west. The light was afternoon gold, slanting in sharp and low, and it made the room look like something from a painting of the kind of life she had been pretending to claim. Edwin set the letter on the small table between them and sat down. He looked at her steadily. "The agency has written to inform me of the death of Clara Whitmore," he said. "Of typhoid fever, on the 9th of September, in Philadelphia." The silence that followed was the most complete and terrible silence Sadie had ever sat inside. She did not dissemble. She did not try to construct another layer of deception over the one that had just crumbled. She had lived with the weight of this lie for 9 days, and it had grown heavier with every conversation, every morning ride, every meal shared at his table, every moment in which he had treated her with the kind of straightforward decency that made the deception increasingly unbearable. "Yes," she said, "Clara Whitmore is dead. I am not Clara Whitmore." He waited. "My name is Sadie Dawson. I was Clara's neighbor and friend. She died 6 days before she was meant to leave for Texas. I had no money, no prospects, and a reason I cannot yet fully explain for needing to leave Philadelphia very urgently. I saw the stage ticket. I made a terrible decision. I have regretted it every hour since I arrived here, but I could not find the courage to confess it because by the time I understood I needed to, I had already started to care very much what you thought of me, and I was afraid of what you would think." She watched him as she said it. He did not move. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but she could see the small, contained adjustments behind his eyes, the rapid internal reckoning of a man who had suspected something and was now processing the confirmation of something larger than he had suspected. "You could have written to me from the road," he said. "I wrote the letter twice and tore it up twice. I knew what it would sound like." "What would it have sounded like?" "Like exactly what it was," she said. "A trap, a forced choice. You either accepting a stranger under false pretenses or turning her away to face something she was afraid to face alone." He was quiet for a long moment. "What is it that you are afraid to face?" he asked. "The reason you needed to leave Philadelphia." She had been thinking, in a distant and conditional way, about whether to tell him about Victor Crane, about whether the full truth was better or worse than the partial truth she had just delivered. Looking at him now, at the severity and the steadiness in his face, she understood that there was no partial truth available to her anymore. It had been the partial truth that had put her here, and the full truth was the only currency she had left. So she told him about Victor Crane, about the ledgers, about the forged land documents and the network of fraudulent claims that Crane's operation had been feeding into the Western Territories for years, about leaving and being warned back, about the year of hiding, about Clara's death and the stage ticket and the desperation that had driven a woman who had never in her life done anything dishonest into the most dishonest act of her existence. When she finished, the light had shifted, and the room was beginning to fill with the early blue of late afternoon. Edwin stood and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the yard and the distant hills. Sadie sat and waited, and she thought, "This is what I deserve. To sit here and wait and not know. This is the consequence of the choice I made." He turned around. "A man named Crane," he said, "with an operation in Philadelphia that forges land documents for the Western Territories." "Yes, and he has reason to believe you could provide evidence against him. I kept the ledgers for 4 months. I know the names of his associates, the nature of the transactions, the dates and amounts. I could put him in federal court." Edwin was quiet again. Then he said, "I had a cousin whose claim in the Oklahoma Territory was stolen from him in 1876 by a fraudulent land transfer. He lost 2 years of work and everything he had put into the land. He never found out who was behind it." Sadie looked at him. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry for all of it." He came back to his chair and sat down. He looked at her with an expression that was complex in a way she had not yet seen from him, not the steady containment of the past 9 days, but something more raw and visible, a man working out something difficult in real time. "You did not steal anything from me," he said finally. "You came here under false pretenses, and that was wrong, and you know it was wrong. But you did not harm this ranch or this household. You have, in fact, been doing the work you claimed you could do." She said nothing. "The bookkeeping errors you found were real," he continued. "The fence assessment you helped me complete was accurate and useful. Dollars has not complained, which is a higher endorsement than it may sound. And you have not been dishonest with me in any conversation we have had, except in the matter of your name." She felt something precarious building in her chest. Hope was too large a word for it. It was smaller than hope, a candle flame in a drafty room. "I am not saying all is forgiven," Edwin said. "I am saying I would like you to stay." The candle did not go out. "I cannot stay under Clara's name," Sadie said. "No," he agreed. "You cannot. The arrangement was with Clara Whitmore. I cannot hold you to that. The arrangement was with a woman who could run a household and manage accounts and ride a fence line and be honest with me," Edwin said. "I am looking at that woman. Her name is apparently Sadie Dawson." She felt the prickling in her eyes that she refused, absolutely, to allow to become tears in front of this man who had just offered her more grace than she had any right to expect. "The townspeople will have questions," she said. "The townspeople will have opinions," he said dryly. "That is not quite the same thing." In spite of everything, she almost smiled. "And the matter of Crane," she said. "If he is looking for me, he may find me eventually. He has resources. He does not have 4,000 acres of Texas cattle country and everyone on it," Edwin said, and the calm certainty with which he said it struck Sadie somewhere beneath the sternum with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its plainness. He was not making a romantic declaration. He was making a statement of fact, the way he made all his statements. He was telling her she was not alone. She had not been not alone in a very long time. The next morning, Edwin drove into Redemption Creek and spoke with the town's single attorney, a man named Alford Beaumont, who maintained a small office above the grain merchant on Main Street, and who was, according to Gus Calloway, the closest thing to a discreet professional that the county offered. The situation he laid out for Beaumont was factual and direct. A woman had arrived on the stage representing herself under another woman's name due to the unexpected death of the intended party. The woman in question, whose name was Sadie Dawson, had come to him, Edwin, voluntarily and fully disclosed the truth within 9 days of her arrival. She was willing to make a proper legal statement of her true identity. He wished to know what, if any, legal complications arose from the situation, and what steps would be required to regularize it. Beaumont, who was 60 years old and had practiced law in Frontier, Texas since 1862, looked at Edwin over the tops of his spectacles for a long moment. "The woman is still in residence on your property?" he asked. "She is," Edwin said. "And you are not seeking to press any claim of fraud or deception against her?" "I am not. And you wish to proceed with the intended arrangement under her correct name and identity?" "If she is willing," Edwin said. "Yes." Beaumont removed his spectacles and polished them with his handkerchief and replaced them. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "I have been practicing law in this county for 16 years, and I have seen more complicated situations than this resolved with less goodwill. The legal position is straightforward enough. The woman used a deceased person's name to claim a stage passage, which is irregular but does not rise to a criminal offense in the ordinary sense, particularly given the extenuating circumstances and the voluntary disclosure. There is no victim who is harmed, since the deceased woman had no further claim on the passage. You will need to establish her identity through a sworn affidavit which I can notarize. After that, you proceed as you see fit." He paused. "I would suggest, for the purposes of social simplicity, telling people only what is necessary, which is that the original arrangement fell through due to a bereavement, and that you have subsequently made an independent arrangement with Miss Dawson, who came to your attention through the same correspondence network. This is not a lie. It is merely an economy of detail." Edwin considered this. "That will do," he said. He also sent, while in town, a telegram. Not to Victor Crane, but to the United States Marshal's office in San Antonio, whose territory included southeastern Texas. The telegram outlined, in brief and unspecific terms, a matter he wished to discuss regarding potential fraudulent land claims originating in Philadelphia. He asked for a response at the earliest convenience. He did not tell Sadie about the telegram to the marshal. Not yet. He wanted something concrete before he raised her hopes about protection that was not yet guaranteed. What he did tell her, when he returned to the ranch that afternoon, was that Beaumont had handled the legal situation and that there was nothing standing in the way of her remaining at the ranch under her own name. He watched the precise quality of the relief that moved across her face, careful and disbelieving, and then genuine, and he felt something shift in him that he had been holding very carefully in a state of suspension since the moment the agency's letter had confirmed what he had already half known. He had been told by the agency that he was to meet a widow of 32 who was sensible and had no romantic illusions. What had arrived instead was a woman 24 years old with dark chestnut hair and river water eyes, who kept his account books with forensic precision and rode fence lines in the early morning with the focused attention of someone who genuinely loved open country, and who was, he was increasingly and uncomfortably certain, one of the most interesting people he had ever met. He was not, by temperament, a man who fell in love easily. He was a man who assessed situations, identified what was true, and acted on it. What was true was that Sadie Dawson had deceived him in a significant way, and had then been honest with him about that deception in a way that had cost her something real, and that the combination of those two things, the failing and the courage to own it, had made her more rather than less interesting to him. He was not going to act on any of that. Not yet. Not while she was in his home under circumstances that created an inherent power imbalance he found troubling. She needed somewhere to be, and he needed to be certain that if she stayed it was because she chose to and not because she had no alternative. He was going to be patient. He was good at being patient. What he was considerably less good at was the way she looked in the early morning light in the kitchen, concentrating on the ledgers with a small vertical line between her brows, or the way she argued with him when she thought he was wrong, which was more often than he might have expected and considerably more often than anyone else in his life was prepared to do, which he found not irritating but entirely refreshing. Gus Calloway noticed. Gus noticed everything. He was 60 years old and had been on ranches his entire life, and had developed over those years an extremely accurate instrument for detecting what was happening between people, particularly the things those people were working hard not to acknowledge. "She's settling in well," Gus observed one morning in the week after the confession, leaning on the corral fence beside Edwin and watching Sadie across the yard, where she was in earnest conversation with Dolers about something involving the kitchen garden. "She is," Edwin said. "Good head for the books," Gus continued. "Yes, good seat on a horse." "Yes." Gus was quiet for a moment. "Then you are not as unaffected by all this as you are trying to appear, boss." Edwin did not say anything. "Just an observation," Gus said mildly and walked away. The response to Edwin's telegram came from San Antonio 10 days later. A deputy United States Marshal by the name of Harrison Webb was assigned to the matter and would be making the ride to Redemption Creek within the fortnight. When Edwin told Sadie that evening, she went very still. "You contacted the Marshal," she said. "What you know about Crane's operation is actionable federal evidence," Edwin said. "He has been running fraudulent land transfers into the Western Territories for years. That is a federal crime. If the Marshal's office has been looking into these claims and can't trace them back to their source, your testimony could be exactly what is needed." Sadie stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window and stood there. She was afraid. Edwin could see that clearly, but it was not the helpless fear of someone without options. It was the specific, more manageable fear of someone who has decided to do something dangerous and is in the process of making herself ready to do it. "If I testify," she said, "Crane's people will know where to find me." "If you do nothing," Edwin said, "Crane's people will eventually find you anyway, and you will have no protection. If you testify and he is prosecuted and convicted, he loses both the motive and the means to reach you." She turned from the window. "You have thought this through." "I have." "Why?" she asked. "Why does this matter to you? You have no obligation to me. I came here under false pretenses. You could have sent me back on the next stage." He looked at her steadily. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because what Crane's operation has been doing to settlers in these territories, stealing legal claims, forging transfers, it is not an abstraction to me. My cousin lost his land and 2 years of his life to something exactly like what you are describing. And because," he paused, "I would prefer that you not have to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." The last part came out with a plainness that was either very deliberate or very unguarded, and he was not entirely certain which it was, and it hung in the kitchen air between them with a weight that was different from the usual weight of their conversations. Sadie looked at him for a long moment. "I will talk to the Marshal," she said. Harrison Webb arrived on the 1st of October. A lean man in his 40s with a close-cropped beard, and the particular careful way of moving that belonged to men who had survived a long time in a dangerous profession. He rode in without ceremony, left his horse at the livery in town, and walked up to Edwin's house in the afternoon. Sadie had been preparing for this meeting the way she had been preparing for everything difficult in her life, by going very quiet and very organized internally, setting out what she knew in her mind in the clear rows that arithmetic had given her, one thing after another, all of it adding up correctly. She sat across from Webb at the kitchen table with Edwin beside her, and she told everything. The 4 months of bookkeeping, the names she remembered, the specific transactions she could recall, the dates, the amounts, the property descriptions that she had entered into the ledgers in her own handwriting. The names of Crane's known associates, 3 of which she had committed to memory because they were the men who had come to her room and made the nature of her situation clear. Webb listened without interrupting. He made notes in a small book with a mechanical pencil. When she finished, he looked at his notes, then at her, then at Edwin. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I need to tell you that the marshal's office in Philadelphia has had Victor Crane under informal surveillance for approximately 14 months. The difficulty has been establishing a direct evidentiary link between Crane personally and the fraudulent transfers. What you have just described would provide that link." Sadie's hands were flat on the table. She did not move them. "What I need from you," Webb continued, "is a formal sworn deposition, which I would prefer to take tomorrow morning while the details are fresh. I also need to know whether you retained any physical documentation, any copies of ledger entries, any receipts, any correspondence." "I have 3 receipts," Sadie said. "I took them when I left, not thinking, just taking things, and I didn't realize until later what I had. They are in my bag." "They have been in my bag since Philadelphia." She could feel Edwin looking at her. She had not told him about the receipts. "I was afraid to mention them," she said, not quite to Webb. "I thought that if anyone knew I had them, I would be in more danger, not less." "You were correct in that assessment," Webb said. "But in the context of a federal case with an active prosecution, those receipts are exactly the kind of primary evidence that transforms a circumstantial case into a criminal conviction. Miss Dawson, if you are willing to testify, and if those receipts are what you describe, Victor Crane will be prosecuted in federal court, and he will not be in a position to threaten anyone again." The deposition was taken the next morning in Alford Beaumont's office above the grain merchant, with Beaumont serving as notary. Sadie dictated with the same precise, organized quality that she brought to bookkeeping, and the result was a 20-page statement that Webb described as the most usable witness testimony he had received in 6 years of federal work. The 3 receipts were initialed and entered into the evidentiary record. When it was over, Sadie walked out of Beaumont's office and stood on the wooden sidewalk of Redemption Creek's Main Street in the October sun, and Edwin stood beside her, and she felt a lightness that was so unfamiliar it took her several moments to identify it. "It is over," she said, not as a question. "The deposition is over," Edwin said. "The prosecution will take time. These things always take time. But the evidence is out of my hands now. Whatever happens next, the evidence exists, and it is in the hands of people who can act on it." "Yes," Edwin said. She turned to look at him. He was standing a foot away from her on the wooden sidewalk with his hat in his hands and the October sun on his face, and she thought, "I deceived this man. I arrived in his life wearing another woman's name and carrying secrets and a dark past that could have brought danger to his door, and he drove me into town and sat beside me while I gave testimony, and he has not asked for a single thing in return for any of it." "Edwin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would like to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go, because I want to stay, because this place is," she stopped, searching, "because this feels like somewhere I could make something real." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like you to stay. I know the arrangement was not with me. The arrangement," he said carefully, "was an attempt to address a practical need in a particular way. It turns out that what arrived instead of that particular solution was something more interesting and considerably more complicated." She looked at him. "What I mean," he said, with the slight stiffness of a man who is saying something that costs him something, "is that I would like you to stay not as an arrangement but as a choice. Mine and yours both." The cottonwood along the street were going yellow in the October light, and a wagon was coming up the main street behind them, and somewhere down the block someone was arguing about the price of something in the dry goods store, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely the most significant moment of Sadie Dawson's 24 years. "All right," she said. "Yes." The weeks that followed had the quality of a life being assembled piece by piece, with care and intention, and the growing recognition that what was being assembled was something neither of them had quite planned, but both of them were becoming invested in with a steadiness that surprised Sadie most of all. She was not, by disposition, a woman who trusted quickly or gave her confidence freely. Her years in Philadelphia, and particularly her time under the shadow of Crane's threat, had made her careful in a way that was almost structural, built into how she moved through the world. She assessed, she maintained a certain distance, she was pleasant but not open. What she found, at the Prescott Ranch in the October and November of 1878, was that the careful distance was becoming difficult to maintain, not because anyone was pressuring her, but because Edwin Prescott was consistently, in his quiet and unhurried way, exactly who he appeared to be. There was no performance in him, no strategy, no hidden motive behind his decency. He was decent because it was the way he was made, and there was something in that straightforward authenticity that was, to a woman who had spent years navigating the carefully concealed intentions of the world, profoundly and dangerously appealing. He taught her to rope in the second week of October, in the small corral behind the barn, with the infinite patience he brought to any practical instruction, and the complete absence of condescension that she had learned to appreciate as one of his most fundamental qualities. She was terrible at it for the first 40 minutes and got significantly better in the next 20. And the moment when the loop finally settled over the post the way it was supposed to, and she turned to him with a triumph that was entirely disproportionate to the achievement. He smiled at her, really smiled, the full unguarded version rather than the small contained version she had been seeing until now, and she felt it in the center of her chest like a struck chord. She had been thinking about kissing him for approximately 3 weeks by then, which she found both inconvenient and entirely appropriate, given the circumstances. She had, for very different reasons, not acted on it. He had been thinking the same thing for longer than he would have admitted, and had also not acted on it, for reasons that were both principled and somewhat inconvenient. The first time he touched her, beyond the ordinary incidental contact of people who live and work in close proximity, was on a Thursday evening in early November. They had been working late at the kitchen table over the quarterly accounts for the cattle sales, and she had made an error in the final column and caught it herself, and was correcting it with the focused irritation she always directed at her own mistakes, and he had leaned across and put his hand over hers on the pen to stop her. "You have already found it and caught it," he said. "It does not require the degree of punishment you appear to be administering." She looked at his hand on hers. He did not immediately remove it. "I dislike making errors," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of the least useful things about you." She looked up at him then, and they were very close in the lamplight, and she said, "Edwin." "Yes," he said, and his voice had dropped slightly. "I think," she said, "that you are about to say something very sensible and considered about the appropriate pace at which this situation should develop." "I was," he said. "Could you," she said carefully, "save it for tomorrow morning?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, and it was neither impulsive nor tentative but the kind of kiss that comes from a decision made with full information. And when he drew back, she was looking at him with the same expression he had been working not to show her for the past 6 weeks, wanting and certain and slightly terrified. "I was going to say," he said after a moment, "that I am in love with you." "That," Sadie said, "is not what I expected you to say." "I know," he said. "I also was not expecting to say it tonight, but we appear to be doing a number of things we were not expecting." She laughed, and the laugh was real and unguarded, and he felt it as the most significant sound he had heard in a very long time. "I am in love with you too," she said. I have been trying not to be for practical reasons, but I appear to have failed. The practical reasons, he said. I came here in deception, she said, and I still feel sometimes that I am occupying a life that was meant for someone else, Clara's life, as if I don't quite have the right to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, this is not Clara's life. It was never Clara's life. Clara's life ended in Philadelphia in September. This is yours. You chose to come here under whatever circumstances, and you have done everything since with a honesty and a work and a courage that is yours and no one else's. Clara Whitmore was a perfectly good woman, and I am sorry for her death, but I am not in love with the idea of Clara Whitmore. I am in love with Sadie Dawson. She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said, was genuinely well said. Don't tell Gus, he said. He will be insufferable. She kissed him again, and this time it was less considered and more joyful, and the lamp burned low on the kitchen table over the corrected accounts, and outside the Texas night was cold and clear and brilliant with stars. Gus Calloway was, in fact, insufferable about it, in the specific way of a man who has been right about something and feels entirely entitled to the enjoyment of that rightness. He said nothing directly to either of them, but the expression he wore for the next several days, a kind of satisfied serenity that his weathered features were not particularly designed to carry, communicated his sentiments with perfect clarity. Dolores said nothing at all, which was considerably more eloquent. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the small Methodist church on the eastern edge of Redemption Creek, in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Aldous Farr that was attended by approximately 40 of the town's residents, which was essentially everyone who could reasonably claim an acquaintance with the Prescott Ranch. Sadie wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that she had bought secondhand in Kansas City on the journey out, and had mended and pressed carefully, and she carried a small bunch of dried sage that Dolores had pressed into her hands that morning, with the firm instruction that it was for good fortune, and that she was not to argue about it. Edwin wore his good coat and a new collar and looked, Gus observed to Pedro in the church pew, like a man who could not quite believe his situation, and was doing his absolute best not to let it show. Alford Beaumont was there, and the grain merchant, and the wife of the livery owner who had brought her 3 children, and a ranching family from the neighboring property who had known Thomas Prescott, and come as much to pay their respects to continuity as to celebrate anything. It was not a grand ceremony. It was a frontier ceremony, with the particular warmth and pragmatism of people who understand that life is uncertain, and the making of a home and a partnership is something to be honored without excessive ceremony, but with genuine feeling. When Reverend Farr asked Edwin whether he would take this woman as his wife, Edwin said yes with a clarity and a directness that made Sadie's breath catch, not because it was loud, but because it was so completely, characteristically him. When he turned to her and she saw his face, she thought, I arrived wearing a dead woman's name, and I was afraid, and I was running from something, and this is where I ended up. And I would not change a single step of the journey that brought me here, because every step of it brought me to this exact moment and this exact man. She said yes. The November letter from Webb, which arrived the day before the wedding, had provided what he called a preliminary positive outcome in the Crane matter. The Philadelphia Marshal's Office, acting in coordination with the Federal Eastern District Court, had executed an arrest warrant for Victor Crane on the 28th of October, 17 days after Sadie's deposition had been received in San Antonio and forwarded to the relevant office. Crane had been taken into custody at his Vine Street establishment, along with 2 of the associates whose names Sadie had identified. The 3 receipts she had provided formed the core of the evidentiary case. Webb wrote, the evidence provided by Miss Dawson is considered determinative. The prosecution expects to proceed to trial in the spring. Your assistance in securing this testimony is noted and appreciated. Miss Dawson should be informed that she may be called to provide additional testimony at trial, though the existing deposition is considered sufficient for the purposes of the arrest and preliminary hearing. Sadie had read this letter 3 times. Then she had folded it very carefully and put it in the small cedar box where she kept the few documents she owned, the letter sitting alongside the notarized affidavit of her identity that Beaumont had prepared, and the receipt for the stage passage from Kansas City that she kept partly as evidence and partly, she admitted to herself, as a kind of talisman, the document that had brought her here. She was not naive about what the trial would require of her. She understood that testifying in a federal prosecution against a man with Victor Crane's resources and connections would be a serious and potentially dangerous undertaking. She understood that there were many months between the current moment and any resolution. She understood that the world was not neat, but she was not alone in it anymore, and that changed, in a fundamental way, the entire nature of what could be faced. The winter of 1878 and early 1879 was cold by Texas standards, with ice on the creek in January and a snow in February that lasted 3 days, which the ranching families in the county discussed for weeks afterward as a notable event. The cattle were moved to the southern pastures, the fireplaces in the limestone house burned steadily, and Sadie and Edwin settled into the particular intimacy of a frontier marriage in winter, which was the intimacy of shared work and shared space and shared silence in a degree of closeness that tested the compatibility of two characters in ways that long-distance correspondence never could. They were, both of them, relieved to discover that they were highly compatible. The things that might have grated between less well-matched people, Edwin's fundamental preference for doing things the correct and established way versus Sadie's tendency to find a more efficient alternative, settled into a productive negotiation rather than a source of conflict. He had opinions about how the ranch record should be structured. She had better ideas. He was not, to his lasting credit, a man who allowed pride to overrule practical advantage, and after the first week in which he had argued for his system and lost clearly and fairly to her superior one, he had adopted the new system without resentment and improved it with his own contributions. She had opinions about the kitchen garden and the management of the household accounts. He had better ideas in several particulars that she had not considered. She was equally capable of recognizing when she was wrong, and the recognition did not diminish her. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, from Edwin's modest but thoughtful library, which included among its volumes a complete Shakespeare, 2 volumes of Dickens, a well-worn copy of Emerson's essays, and several years of a scientific journal that Edwin had subscribed to and which Sadie found unexpectedly fascinating. She was a better reader aloud than he was, with a natural sense of rhythm and character that brought the texts alive, and he listened with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And sometimes the reading led to long conversations about ideas that neither of them had had anyone to discuss with for years. On those evenings, in the lamplight with the fire going and the Texas winter pressing at the windows, Sadie understood what she had been missing in all the years of rented rooms and isolation and survival. Not just security, not just protection. This, the particular quality of being known by another person and knowing them in return and finding that what you know is good. In March of 1879, a second letter from Webb arrived informing them that the Victor Crane prosecution was proceeding to trial in April. The trial was being held in Philadelphia before the Federal Eastern District Court. Sadie's presence as a witness was requested but not required, given the strength of the deposition and physical evidence. The U.S. Marshal's office was prepared to arrange safe passage and accommodation if she chose to attend. She and Edwin discussed it for 3 evenings. "I want to go," Sadie said on the second evening. "I need to see it concluded. I need to be there." "Then we will go," Edwin said. "Edwin, the ranch, the spring drive." "Gus has managed this ranch's spring operations before," Edwin said. "He will manage them again, and if you go with me beside you." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "I am quite capable of managing this on my own," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That is not why I want to come. I want to come because I want to be there, because this matters to me and because it matters to you and because I am your husband." She was quiet for a moment. "Also," he added, with the slight dry inflection that she had come to love, "Gus has been waiting for an opportunity to run the spring operations independently for 2 years. He will be extremely satisfied." She smiled. "All right," she said. "We go together." They left for Philadelphia in early April, traveling by stage to San Antonio, then by train through the growing network of rail lines that now connected the major southern and eastern cities. It was Sadie's first experience of the train since her original move from Harrisburg to Philadelphia years earlier, and for Edwin, it was only his second significant train journey, the first having been a single trip to Kansas City for ranch business 2 years before. They traveled through a country that was in the middle of extraordinary transition. The rail lines were cutting through landscapes that had been, a decade earlier, the exclusive domain of the Comanche and Kiowa nations, and the great buffalo herds that had sustained them. And what Sadie saw through the train window in Texas and Oklahoma territory and the borderlands was the particular American spectacle of a new order being constructed at the expense of an old one. Towns where there had been open range, fences where there had been none. The remnants of what had been a profoundly different kind of world visible in the expressions of the indigenous people she saw at the stations, and in the territories they passed through. She said this to Edwin as they sat in the train car somewhere in Missouri, watching the landscape change into the greener and more densely human country of the East. He was quiet for a moment. "My father came to Texas in 1857, he said. "There were Comanche raids on the settlements in that country for the next 15 years. I grew up with the results of those raids and with the army campaigns against them. I do not pretend that the world we are living in was built cleanly. The land my father settled on was taken from people who had lived on it. That is true, and I cannot make it untrue. What I can do is try to be honest about what it is and try not to add to the injustice of it." She looked at him. "That is a more considered view than most men in your position would take," she said. "Most men in my position find it convenient not to look directly at things," he said. "I find that inconvenient thinking always costs more in the long run than the honest version." She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her with an expression of such open and undefended warmth that she felt it as a kind of gift. The trial of Victor Crane before the Federal Eastern District Court of Pennsylvania lasted 4 days. Sadie did not take the stand, as Webb had indicated the deposition and physical evidence were sufficient, but she sat in the gallery with Edwin beside her through all 4 days, and she watched Victor Crane across the courtroom with the steadiness of a woman who has finished being afraid of something. Crane looked at her once. He looked at her with the cold, specific recognition of a man who understood precisely what her testimony had cost him and what was about to happen to him as a result. She looked back without flinching. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Victor Crane was convicted on all 11 counts of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud settlers in the Western Territories. He received a sentence of 12 years in federal penitentiary. 2 of his associates received sentences of 8 and 6 years respectively. When the verdict was read, Sadie sat very still. Edwin was watching her. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, and then she looked up at the high windows of the courtroom and the April light coming through them, and she breathed out very slowly. She did not cry. She had done her crying years ago, in the boarding house in Philadelphia, and in Clara's room at the end, and in the dark hours of the nights on the Prescott Ranch before she had found her footing there. She had already spent what tears this particular story was owed. What she felt now was not grief but completion, a line drawn under a chapter. They walked out of the courthouse into the Philadelphia spring, which was green and cool and nothing like the open burnt gold country of South Texas, and Edwin stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to her. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with the full, unguarded expression that she had come to think of as the real face of Edwin Prescott, the one he kept very carefully managed in most situations and reserved, she had come to understand, for moments of genuine feeling. "I am very proud of you," he said. "What you did in that deposition, the precision and courage of it. I want you to understand how remarkable that was." She looked at him. "I had a good reason to be thorough," she said. "What reason?" "Someone I love very much had a cousin who lost his land," she said, "and there were others like him, and the people responsible were continuing to do it. That seemed like reason enough." He pulled her close on the courthouse steps in the April sun and held her, and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held. And all around them, the city of Philadelphia went about its business entirely unaware that something significant had just concluded in the life of a woman who had arrived in it some years earlier with nothing, and was leaving it now with everything that actually mattered. They visited Clara's grave before leaving the city. Sadie had wanted to. She had found the location through the records at the church she and Clara had attended together. And on the morning before their departure, she and Edwin hired a carriage and went to the cemetery on the edge of the city where Clara had been buried. The grave was modest, marked with a simple stone that the boarding house proprietress, a woman named Mrs. Holt, had arranged, because Clara had had no family remaining to do it. Sadie had not known this until the day before, when she had called on Mrs. Holt to thank her and settle the small debt she still owed her for the last month's rent that she had fled without paying. She stood at the grave for a long time. Edwin stood slightly back, giving her the space to do this in her own way. "She would have liked you," Sadie said finally. "She had very good judgment about people. She had extraordinary patience, and she was the most genuinely kind person I have known, apart from my father. She deserved a long and good life." She paused. "I do not think she would resent what happened. She was not that kind of person. I think she would be satisfied that her stage ticket got her friend to safety. She would probably have found that very like her, arranging things efficiently from beyond the grave." Edwin said nothing, but he came to stand beside her. "I am sorry I never got to write to you from the road," Sadie said to the gravestone. "I am sorry I took the coward's way, but I think you knew me well enough to know why, and I think you would have done exactly the same thing in my position, and I think you would be glad of how it all came out." She placed on the grave the small bunch of dried wildflowers she had bought from a street vendor on the way, and stood there for another quiet moment. And then she turned and took Edwin's arm, and they walked back through the cemetery to the hired carriage. They returned to Redemption Creek on the 22nd of April, 1879, arriving on the stage from San Antonio in the late afternoon, and what greeted them on the main street of town was evidence that word had preceded them, as word always did in small towns. Gus Calloway was at the stage stop, ostensibly to collect some delivered goods but transparently there to see them home, and his expression when he saw them step off the stage was as close to sentimental as that weathered face was ever going to get. The spring drive had been completed in their absence, successfully and without significant incident, which Gus reported with the satisfied air of a man who has been waiting 2 years to demonstrate his independent competence. "3 heads short of what I'd have managed," Edwin told him, with straight-faced precision. Gus looked at him for a long moment. "I would like to see you say that with a straight face after 2 weeks on a train," he said. Edwin kept the straight face for another 3 seconds and then allowed it to break, which was, Sadie observed, the most she had ever seen those 2 men display open affection for each other, and she found it entirely wonderful. The ranch was exactly as they had left it, except that Dollars had cleaned every room, and the kitchen garden was showing its first spring growth, and there was a pie cooling on the kitchen table, which Dollars denied having made with an utterly unconvincing firmness. That evening, in the quiet of the house with the spring light fading over the Texas hills, Sadie stood on the porch and looked out at the land that was hers now, legally and truly, and without any qualification. The night hawks were out in the early dusk and the first stars were appearing, and the air smelled of the spring grass, and the creek, and the particular complex mineral sweetness of this specific piece of country that she had been learning to read over the 7 months she had been here. Edwin came and stood beside her. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the way people stand when they are comfortable enough with each other that silence does not need to be filled. "I want to write to her family," Sadie said eventually. "Clara's. You said she had no one, but I want to make sure. I want there to be a proper record of her somewhere." "We can do that," Edwin said. She paused. "I want to do something with the knowledge I have about the territory land claim frauds, the ones that went through before anyone could stop them. I know that the evidence I provided covered Crane's operation going back 3 years, but there were fraudulent transfers before that. Families who lost claims. Some of them are probably still in the territories trying to rebuild." He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking that Webb would know the extent of the problem. And I am thinking that someone with good bookkeeping skills and knowledge of how these fraudulent transfers were structured could potentially help identify which claims were affected, which families have a legitimate grievance that could still be addressed." He was quiet for a moment. "That would be voluntary work," he said. "Unpaid. I know. It would take time. I know. Webb would probably be glad of the help," Edwin said thoughtfully. "That was my assessment as well." He looked at her with that expression, the full, unguarded one, the real face. "Sadie Dawson," he said. "Edwin Prescott," she said. "I am exceedingly glad," he said, "that you got on that stage." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the darkening country. "So am I," she said. The spring and summer of 1879 were the most settled, the most genuinely contented months of Sadie's life. She began corresponding with Harrison Webb on the matter of the affected land claims, and he proved to be both grateful and practical about the assistance, forwarding her the files that related to properties in the Texas and Oklahoma territories, whose transfer documents matched the pattern she had identified from her knowledge of Crane's methods. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing the formal territorial land records against the fraudulent patterns, and she did it at the kitchen table in the evenings when the ranch accounts were done, with Edwin working on his own papers beside her, the two of them in comfortable parallel industry. 3 affected families were identified in the first 6 months of her work. One of them, a black farming family in Oklahoma Territory named Hollies, had lost a 160-acre claim in 1876 through a transfer that Sadie identified as definitively fraudulent in its structure. She wrote a detailed analysis for Webb, who forwarded it to the territorial court with a letter of support from the marshal's office, and in August of 1879, the Hollies claim was restored by federal court order. She heard about this in a letter from Webb in September, and she read the letter twice and then set it on the table and sat quietly with it for a moment. Edwin read it over her shoulder. He put his hands on her shoulders from behind and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and that was the right response. She wrote back to Webb confirming that she would continue the work. She found out in October that she was expecting a child. She told Edwin on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen over coffee, with the directness that was by then entirely characteristic of their relationship with each other. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." He stood up from the table, and she could see that he was, for once, completely without his customary composure, not from distress, but from an emotion too large to be contained in his usual measured manner. He came around the table and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression of such pure, unperformative joy that she felt it as the most intimate thing she had ever witnessed. "Spring," he said. "April, I believe," she said. He kissed her, and then he sat back down and picked up his coffee and set it down again without drinking it, and sat for a moment with the expression of a man who is reorienting himself to a fundamentally revised understanding of what his life is. "You are going to be magnificent at this," he said. "I have absolutely no idea what I am doing," she said. I expect Dollars will be the primary authority for the first year. Dollars will be insufferable, he said, with great fondness. Dollars was, indeed, from the moment she was informed, completely in her element in a way that suggested she had been waiting for this development since approximately the day Sadie had stepped off the stage. She reorganized the upstairs room that had been used for storage into a proper nursery with such efficiency and such excellent taste that Sadie looked at the completed room one afternoon and felt an emotion she couldn't entirely name, something between gratitude and wonder and the specific poignancy of being well cared for. Gus Calloway, when informed, said simply, "Good." And then he went to the barn and came back 20 minutes later with a small wooden horse he had apparently carved at some previous point for no particular stated reason, which he handed to Edwin without explanation and walked away. Edwin held the small wooden horse and looked after Gus's retreating back and then at Sadie, and she said, "That is the most sentimental thing I have ever seen." And he said, "Don't tell Gus that." The winter of 1879 was mild. The ranch accounts for the year showed the strongest profit since before Thomas Prescott's death. The correspondence with Webb's office continued productively. Sadie's condition progressed without significant difficulty, and the household adapted around it with the ease of a well-functioning unit. She received, in February of 1880, a letter from Mrs. Holt, the Philadelphia boarding house proprietress, informing her that Clara Whitmore had indeed had a cousin in Baltimore who had subsequently been located and informed of Clara's death, and who had been grateful for the proper burial that Mrs. Holt had arranged. The cousin had asked Mrs. Holt to pass along his thanks to anyone who had been in Clara's life in her final months. Sadie wrote back to the cousin directly, telling him something of Clara, what she had been like, the particular quality of her kindness, the thoughtfulness of her company. It seemed important that someone who had known her well should write that letter. She also sent, enclosed with the letter, the pressed sage from her wedding day, which she had kept in the cedar box. It had seemed to belong there, with the record of Clara's memory, as evidence that her friend's final act of inadvertent generosity had led somewhere good. James Edwin Prescott was born on the 3rd of April, 1880, in the upstairs bedroom of the Limestone Ranch house, delivered by the town's physician who had ridden out from Redemption Creek in the early morning. He was a healthy, substantial, loud-voiced boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an expression of severe personal grievance at the world that, Edwin observed with uncharacteristic whimsy, was either a sign of strong character or a sign that he had strong opinions about being born. Sadie held him in the morning light coming through the bedroom window and felt the specific, overwhelming enormity of it, the complete reorganization of the world around this new and astonishingly small person. Edwin sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression that had by now become familiar to Sadie, the full real face, unguarded and complete. "James," Sadie said, "for your father's name." "And Edwin," Edwin said, "for the persistent optimism of naming a child after yourself." She laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet morning room seemed to her in that moment like the purest expression of everything that had changed in the 2 years since a woman with dark chestnut hair and terrible secrets had stepped off a stage in a dusty Texas town and looked into the gray eyes of the man who would become her husband. Dollars came in 10 minutes later and took charge of things with such magnificent efficiency that both Sadie and Edwin simply allowed themselves to be organized, and the household rotated around the new center of gravity, with the particular adaptation that functional households make to the arrival of the thing that was always, in some sense, missing. The Prescott Ranch in the spring and summer of 1880 was a different place from what it had been 18 months earlier. Not dramatically different in its physical character, the limestone house still stood solid on its rise above the creek. The cattle still moved between the pastures with the seasonal logic of range management. The cottonwood along the creek still marked the water with their silvery movement. but the human quality of it had changed in ways that were felt rather than seen. A density of life, of purpose and relationship and continuity that had not been there before. Pedro and the other hands had welcomed James with the particular warm practicality of people who spend their lives working land and understand instinctively that children and continuity are part of what they are working for. Gus held the baby once, very briefly, with the focused, careful attention of a man handling something irreplaceable, and handed him back to Sadie with the expression of someone who has just confirmed an important hypothesis and is satisfied with the result. Edwin wrote to the Westward Hearths Agency in Kansas City. Not to complain, not to explain the full irregular history of their arrangement, but simply to inform them that he was married, that his household was well, and that he wished them success in their work. He enclosed a small donation for their operating fund, which he signed with both their names. He showed Sadie the letter before sending it. "That is very generous," she said. "Of your own free will, donating to the agency that sent you a woman who was not the woman you ordered." "The agency did exactly what it was supposed to do," Edwin said. "The rest was managed by other forces." "By your wife's considerable capacity for poor decision-making," Sadie said, but she was smiling. "By circumstance," Edwin said, "and by two people who happened to be well-matched in ways neither of them could have predicted." She took the letter and added a postscript in her own hand. The postscript said, "This arrangement succeeded in ways that were entirely unplanned and considerably better than either party could have designed. We wish to express our genuine gratitude." By the summer of 1880, Harrison Webb had forwarded Sadie's case analyses on 6 additional affected land claims, 4 of which had been substantiated and were in various stages of territorial court review. The work had attracted the attention of a federal land commissioner in Washington who wrote to Webb asking for a formal summary of the analytical methodology, and Webb had forwarded the request to Sadie with a note that said she should feel entirely free to decline, but that if she were inclined to respond, the work would be more influential than she might realize. She showed the letter to Edwin over supper. He read it and handed it back to her. "What would you like to do?" he said. "I would like to write the summary," she said, "but I want to put it under both our names. The work comes from the ranch, from our life here, and you have been part of it since the beginning." He considered this for a moment. "The ranch books are already under both our names," he said. "This is different." "Not particularly," he said. "It is still the work of this household." She looked at him with an expression that by now he knew exactly how to read. "You are, consistently, the most reasonable man I have ever met," she said. "I take that as the highest compliment," he said. She wrote the summary over the course of 3 weeks, working in the evenings at the kitchen table, and it was an 18-page document of analytical clarity and practical usefulness that Webb subsequently described to his superiors as the most useful single piece of work, product his office had received in connection with the Crane case aftermath. The federal land commissioner circulated it internally, and it became the basis for a systematic review of territorial land transfers in the period 1873–1879. A review that ultimately identified and restored 23 fraudulently obtained claims across Texas, Oklahoma Territory, and Kansas. Sadie learned about the final number in a letter from Webb in the spring of 1881, when James was almost a year old and toddling around the kitchen floor with the fearless energy of a child who had not yet been taught to be afraid of things, and she sat at the kitchen table with the letter and was quiet for a long time, and then she went to find Edwin in the barn. He was doing something entirely practical with a section of harness. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it and looked at her. 23 families, she said. 23 families, he repeated. Clara would have been extremely pleased, Sadie said. She had strong opinions about people being treated fairly. He came to her and put his arms around her, and she rested against his chest in the warm, hay-smelling quiet of the barn, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the spring light came through the slatted walls, and everything was, for that moment, as exact and true and clean as numbers that add up correctly. She had arrived in Redemption Creek wearing a dead woman's name, carrying secrets and a dark past, and a desperate hope that somewhere in this vast open country there was a place for her. She had found it not by being someone she was not, but by becoming, in the long, careful work of honesty and labor and love, entirely and completely herself. The debt she had been living under, the fear, the concealment, the borrowed identity, all of it had resolved over the course of 2 years into something she had not thought to call by its right name for a very long time: home. Edwin Prescott, who had sat down one evening in 1878 to write a letter to a correspondence agency in Kansas City, because the loneliness had become something he could almost touch, had received in exchange for that letter not the practical arrangement he had requested, but something that had complicated and deepened and expanded his life in every direction he could name, and several he had not known were available to him. He would tell Gus, years later, when pressed with the specific persistence that old friendship permits, that he had known from the moment she stepped off the stage that something was wrong. And he would tell him that he had also known, in the same moment, with the same certainty, that whatever was wrong was less important than everything else he could see. Gus would say that this was the most words he had ever heard Edwin use to describe an emotion. Edwin would say that it seemed to warrant them. The fall of 1881 found the Prescott Ranch in its strongest position in a decade, with a full crew, a healthy herd, the accounts in excellent order, and a household that had become the kind of place where people liked to be, which was, Dollars maintained, the real measure of whether a house had been properly made into a home. James was walking and talking, and had opinions about the horses that were beginning to rival his father's in their specificity, and Dollars maintained that he had his grandfather's hands, which nobody who had known Thomas Prescott had the authority to confirm or deny, but which seemed like a good thing to believe. Sadie was, by November of 1881, expecting again. She told Edwin the same way she had told him the first time, plainly and directly over the kitchen table. He received it the same way, with the same loss of composure and the same complete, undefended joy. "Spring again," he said. "March this time," she said. "James will have opinions about a sibling," he said. "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by that honestly." Edwin looked at her with the expression that she had never stopped finding the most significant thing in her daily life. "Do you know," he said, "that I look at this life and I genuinely cannot account for it. The parts of it that are good are so much beyond what I thought to plan for." "That is because you planned for practical things," Sadie said. "And you got those, but you got them along with everything else." "Along with you," he said. "Along with me," she agreed, "and everything I brought with me. The dark past," he said, "the secrets, all resolved," she said. "The hidden motive," he said, with the slight dry tone that meant he was being affectionate rather than serious. "A woman trying to stay alive is not a hidden motive," she said. "It is just a motive. A forbidden arrival," he tried. "Now you are reaching," she said. He laughed, the open, unguarded laugh that she had been hearing more and more frequently in the 3 years of their marriage, the laugh that she thought of as the best sound she knew. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he folded his fingers around hers with the easy, habitual warmth of two people who have learned each other thoroughly. Outside the limestone house, the November wind was moving through the cottonwood along the creek, and the stars were coming up over the Texas hills in their thousands, and the horses were settled in the barn, and the ranch accounts showed a healthy year, and somewhere in the house upstairs a small boy slept with complete confidence in the world, because the world he had been born into was safe and warm and built by people who loved each other, and who had arrived at that love by one of the most circuitous and desperate and ultimately necessary routes imaginable. Sadie Dawson Prescott, who had stepped off a stage in September of 1878 wearing a dead woman's name and carrying everything she owned in a single leather bag, sat in her own kitchen in her own house on land that was hers and her husband's and their sons and their coming child's. And she was, for the first time since her father was alive, not afraid. She was not afraid, and she was not alone, and she was home. And Edwin Prescott, who had written a letter to a correspondence agency because the loneliness had become a weight that would not shift, held the hand of the woman who had changed his life in every direction it could be changed, and thought, "This is what I did not know to ask for. This is what arrived instead." And every practical and calculating part of him, every part that had always dealt in what was true rather than what was hoped, confirmed what the rest of him had known since a chestnut-haired woman with river-water eyes had stepped off the overland stage and looked at him with terrified courage and said hello. It was the best trade he had ever made.